Hi everyone, we'll be waiting 2 to 3 minutes before starting the webinar to accommodate for the rest of the attendees who are in the middle of connecting. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valan Kolika and I'll be your host for today. Just a few reminders before we start. If you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation and you're using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. If you're using the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. And all the links that I'll be referencing, they're already published in the IM Q&A site and where you can reference. Closed captions in several languages are available during the live broadcast, and you can enable them by clicking on the CC button located at the lower right corner of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window, simply by clicking on the Ask Question button. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. We love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars, which you can do so at aka.ms/security-webinar feedback. I would also like to invite you to join our public community by visiting aka.ms/security community. That's the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews, which, by the way, you can sign up at aka.ms/security-prp. You can request features, give feedback, review our product roadmaps, register for events, or just join webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. In today's session, Eden Cohen will revisit here with us a costly lesson that is in cybersecurity history. That is the billion-dollar central bank Heist. Eden is a principal program manager with the Azure security team. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to him. Eden, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. For those in the US, good afternoon, good night for our international audience. And I'm so excited to be able to talk to you today about two of my favorite topics, cybersecurity and international finance. And I've come here today to share with you what I think is not only a true story, but really a mesmerizing story of what can happen when banks get their security wrong. And it applies not only to banks, but way beyond that, as you will see. This is an event that happened exactly 5 years ago. So that makes it a very good opportunity to examine what happened and to learn from it with the benefit of hindsight. I want to welcome you to Bangladesh. That is the venue of the day. That is the venue of the largest cyber bank heist to date. Bangladesh, as you may or may not know, is a developing country. It's on the Bay of Bengal, bordered by India to the west and Myanmar to the east. And it's not a big country by any means, at least not territorially. It's half the size of Philadelphia, you can see in this overlay, and it's only a little larger than Virginia, but it's many, many times more populated, it's crowded, it's poor, and it faces disastrous flooding and harsh consequences by rising sea levels. And I'm saying all that to make it clear that when our story takes place, Bangladesh has pressing needs, even before COVID and some of the recent hardships. And it has pretty meager funds with which it can and has to meet these needs. Every penny and every dollar in its state coffers are essential to the livelihood of its more than 160 million inhabitants. What you see here is the south of Dhaka, which is the capital city. And the building right here with the green circle around it is known as Bangladesh Bank. It's a central bank, pretty much like the US Federal Reserve. It acts as the banker of the government. It manages the country's foreign reserves. It controls the money supply, the taka, their local currency. And it's the lender of last resort to other local banks. It also regulates financial institutions and does a lot more. Now, like many other central banks, Bangladesh Bank maintains most of its international deposits, its reserves in New York. It has an account with the New York Fed, and it uses that account to conduct the vast majority of Bangladesh's international transactions. This is an account that, as of that day, 5 years ago, had more than $25 billion. It's the money of the people, by the people, and for the people of the Republic of Bangladesh. Let's take a little look inside. We're going to Friday, February 5th, 2016. Bangladesh is a majority Muslim country, so Friday and Saturday are the days off, which means that everybody's away except for the on-call manager. On that day, that manager was Mr. Zubair bin Huda. Remember this name. And as part of his duty, he inspects the back office systems at the accounting and budgeting department, which is the most restricted part of the bank. And part of his routine duties is to look at the printer. He approaches the printer and he notices something odd. This is a printer that's responsible for capturing each of the bank's wire transfers. And usually there are just a couple of those in a day, in a work day. This is a weekend, mind you. And today, that printer was working overtime. And each of its confirmations looked like gibberish. This wasn't the first or the second glitch that he's seen with the printer, so he didn't make too much of it. He filed a service call for a technician, turned off the lights, and headed home in time for the Friday family dinner. Next day, Saturday, it's February 6th, and it's still the weekend, and Mr. Bin Huda is still the on-call manager. He's back at the bank, and this time with a technician. They decide to head over to what's known as the Swift room, which has the servers that are connected to that printer, because after all, the printer seems fine. Maybe the problem is with the server. What you see here is called the Swift terminal, and it's a very sensitive system because it's used to wire the government's money to foreign bank accounts, and it's also connected to that printer. So they approach this system, and being the duty manager, Bin Huda has the credentials for this. So he tries to log in, but the application crashes time and time again. And he grows increasingly frustrated because it's not only the printer that's misbehaving, something else is going wrong. So Bin Huda decides to scan the accounting department's inbox. Maybe in that inbox, there is some notification about a known service disruption with Swift. So he goes back to the office, and lo and behold, there is a message awaiting from the Federal Reserve, and it's been sitting there for about a day. And it says something like, our audit systems have detected highly unusual wire activity. We have therefore placed a hold on most transfers. Get in touch with our accounts hotline. This doesn't sound good. The Federal Reserve is saying that it's investigating suspicious orders, and it's made by the bank to private accounts in Asia. Bin Huda really has no idea what this is about because Bangladesh Bank doesn't send payment instructions on weekends, and this had to be a mistake. But how does he contact this accounts hotline or the accounts investigator? That is not clear. And as Bin Huda plans his next steps, the technician strikes gold. She's able to extract a recent log generated on that Swift machine, and opening that log, it looks like there are records of a batch of outgoing wire transactions, and they total almost $1 billion. Bin Huda sifts through these records to understand where these alleged orders are headed. One transaction says Pan Asia Banking, and a lot of the others are saying Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation. But which banks are these? And where are the associated bank accounts? What in the world is going on? Bin Huda and the technician get back to their open space and search the web to understand who these institutions are. It turns out that these are two commercial banks. One is in Sri Lanka and the other is in the Philippines. And looking through their historical records, Bangladesh Bank has never transacted with any of them. In fact, most of its business it does directly with other central banks, but these are not central banks. So it seems like a major software problem with that Swift terminal, likely a bug, compounded by the fact that they couldn't even log on to the terminal. So at 2 p.m., Bin Huda emails a Swift case manager in Belgium to report what he calls a big problem. Now, we also tried to call the Fed in New York, but the phone number that he found online wouldn't answer on a weekend. So he resorted to an email address and a fax number that he found on their website. He wrote a rush demand to the Fed to stop processing all of these alleged payments with references to those same entries that he saw on the Swift log. And after sending the email, they struggled a little with the fax machine, but finally got that done. And with a sigh of relief, Bin Huda shut down his computer and went home for what was left of that pretty disturbing afternoon. Next day, it's Sunday, the 7th of February, and the start of the week in Bangladesh. Bin Huda briefs his management about the past weekend's events, and pretty soon, it was clear to everyone that funds were being siphoned, and the bank grew increasingly panicked. Rushed meetings were held, managers redoubled Bin Huda's efforts in trying to stop all payments to Rizal, or known by the acronym RCBC, Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation. That's the one in the Philippines. And they also did the same for Pan Asia Bank in Sri Lanka. Fortunately, they managed to get hold of Pan Asia Bank, and they confirmed that a payment of $20 million had reached them, but they decided to place it on hold because something with the payment order was fishy. But the other bank, RCBC in the Philippines, whose name was on transfers totaling many hundreds of millions of dollars, was entirely unreachable. That Sunday would come to be known in the bank as Terrible Sunday. It's Monday, February 8th in New York, and the Fed is finally back from the weekend. Over the weekend, Bangladesh banks sent them urgent orders to stop all payments, but when Fed employees finally saw them, it was actually too late to undo the damage. By that time, several orders were already deposited with RCBC in the Philippines. And meanwhile, 2,000 miles away from Bangladesh is RCBC Bank. According to the Fed, $81 million from Bangladesh were already deposited to RCBC bank accounts in the Philippines. The Chinese or Lunar New Year is a national holiday in many countries across Asia, including the Philippines. And the 8th of February was exactly that day. Like most other businesses, banks are closed on that day, and dozens of messages from Bangladesh Bank that were sent to RCBC were simply ignored. None of them were read in time to stop the ongoing fraud. And while these Bangladeshi bureaucrats and state officials were busy writing and moving letters around, the perpetrators were having a field day. This is Entertainment City in Manila. It's a notorious haven for funny money. And within hours of the Bangladeshi funds reaching accounts at RCBC, the money was transferred into gambling accounts at the Solaire Resort and Casino. And once it got there, unregistered gamesters would cash out the money as chips, place bets, and ultimately convert it all back into untraceable cash. It ended up being one of the biggest bank thefts in history, robbing the Bangladeshi government of more than $80 million. Now it's time to go behind the scenes, and let's try to understand how this happened and what we can all learn from this. And last but not least, I'm sure you guys are curious, what do we know about the group behind all this? The story of this cyber heist begins not in February of 2016, but at least 9 months earlier. This is the skyline of Metro Manila in the Philippines. It's also known as Makati City. And the tower, which I've circled here, is the headquarters of RCBC, which by now we're somewhat familiar with. On Tuesday, May the 5th, 2015, 4 bank accounts were opened at RCBC with a $500 deposit in each. They were opened by fake identities using fake addresses, and they would lay dormant until 9 months later in February of 2016. It's not unusual for cyber criminals to be very patient when it suits them. For the perpetrators, after opening these accounts, the next step was to breach the network of Bangladesh Bank, and gaining access to one of the systems was their initial objective. There are many ways to accomplish this, and the truth is it remains unclear what specific method they used, but it was very likely one of the following. The first is maybe they exploited a vulnerability in the networking gear. Why am I saying this? Because the bank happened to use cheap home routers that were running old software to connect itself both internally and externally. It had no dedicated firewall and was essentially exposed to the open internet. This makes it easy for a remote attacker to fingerprint which hardware is used, and then to find known vulnerabilities and penetrate the network's perimeter. And that's how you can get to some system inside the network. Another likely option, perhaps even more likely, is spear phishing. The attackers likely send scam emails carrying zero-day malware to bank employees. If these employees open these emails, it installed malware. This requires a virus that can evade email threat scanners if such scanners are even present, and to take advantage of unpatched vulnerabilities. We've actually seen this happen in an earlier and smaller attack on a Vietnamese bank by a very similar group, which compromised a previously unknown document rendering weakness in the Foxit PDF reader. Overall, phishing and social engineering still drive about 90% of all successful breaches, so this is the most vulnerable category. Another classic is removable media. It works similar to spear phishing, but it lets the attackers get around email filters. It still requires a zero-day exploit and some clever ploy to get that physical device into a system inside the network. This is probably why you should never accept a USB flash drive as an unsolicited freebie. And lastly, I want to mention that there were also speculations of collusion, meaning an insider job. Like other developing countries, Bangladesh's government and their banking institutions, they're notoriously plagued by corruption. In a recent Corruption Perceptions Index by Transparency International, Bangladesh ranks in the bottom quintile of all countries. And that means that bank frauds are more prone to happen. Insiders can turn from being regulators and gamekeepers to wrongdoers and poachers. However, they managed to get inside. Once the attackers made it into the perimeter, they systematically moved throughout the network in search of valuable data and prized assets. This is what we call lateral movement. As soon as they compromised the first machine, the attackers downloaded malware tools that gave them a connection to a command and control server. And this basically gave them ongoing visibility and ongoing control. The attackers now had a compromised system and a beachhead from which they could scout the rest of the network and spread into additional systems. They analyzed network communications and tried to blend in with legitimate traffic in order to establish a profile of what systems were nearby, what roles those systems had, and what known vulnerability the software of those systems was vulnerable to. And armed with all this information and probably a few keyloggers, just for good measure, the next objective was to capture local admin credentials from one of these infected machines. As the attackers made their advance in a cautious process that took many weeks, they targeted additional accounts in order to facilitate the next stages of the breach. And by doing so, they could now spy over the network and continue to spread laterally across it, searching for higher value data and higher value systems. Using those compromised admin credentials, they could do all this for long periods of time and remain undetected. Whenever they identified an interesting target, they would again escalate privileges to install malicious remote controlled software and continue in their conquest. It was a rinse and repeat process. But all along, their goal was clear. What they really wanted was to penetrate the systems connected to SWIFT. So I've been mentioning SWIFT, but what is SWIFT? So SWIFT stands for the Society of Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. Not very useful, I'm aware. So in layman's speak, this is a secure platform to enable international money transfers. It's used by thousands of institutions, from medium banks and large banks to basically all of the world's central banks. But the most surprising element of SWIFT, which few people really know, is that it doesn't actually move any money. Instead, SWIFT is a secure platform for messages about money transfers. Let me explain. If Bangladesh Bank legitimately wants to send money to the Philippines, it will send them a SWIFT message with all of the details. The message would also be sent to the Federal Reserve in New York because it has bank accounts for both Bangladesh's central bank and the Philippines. Moving money between these two accounts is actually a matter for the Federal Reserve in New York. If the sending bank and the receiving bank don't have an account with the same institution, such as the Fed in New York, then SWIFT will help identify what they call a corresponding bank. This is an additional link in a longer chain which will bridge the two banks together. It's like routing packets between endpoints. If the packets are not on the same network, then you need to route them through one or more switches. These are the corresponding banks. SWIFT itself operates a closed messaging network for all of its member banks, and it passes tens of millions of those messages every day. It's responsible for sanction screening and for enforcing anti-terrorism requirements. In fact, it's one of the main tools that the previous American administration used to impose sanctions on countries like Iran. But there's one thing that SWIFT didn't do. It didn't try to detect fraud. Payments made by one institution to another institution are usually automated. In fact, it's common to have something known as straight-through processing from a person's request made through their bank's website and immediately onto the SWIFT network without many checks or balances. To protect the system, what SWIFT does do is it makes sweeping security recommendations and many different best practices, which includes asking banks and member institutions to have a dedicated room for SWIFT equipment with 24/7 monitoring, to utilize layered authentication protocols, complex passwords, multi-factor authentication, and more. But evidently, it didn't require these. All paying members can enjoy access to SWIFT independent of their internal security practices. To my knowledge, the core SWIFT network is very secure, but that may or may not apply to the thousands of member bank terminals. In other words, thieves don't have to attack the core network, which is highly fortified. Instead, they can attempt to compromise the systems that feed in and out of the SWIFT network, and that would include Bangladesh Bank and its systems in the SWIFT room that we've seen earlier. So what did it require to take over that SWIFT terminal? Banks typically separate their SWIFT systems from the rest of their IT network. And until October of 2015, Bangladesh Bank did exactly that. But then they decided to launch a new service called real-time gross settlements for faster clearing. And it was just something to speed up money transfers. A lot of banks rolled that at the same time. But as a result, they made the fatal mistake of connecting their IT network to their SWIFT connected systems. So this removed the air gap that existed between the two networks. It gave attackers an easy path from the compromised IT systems to the highly sensitive SWIFT machines. The attackers managed to successfully log in as local admins, and they did this using account credentials that they've already stolen. What they then did was install Sysmon from Windows sysinternals. It's a tool that helps you monitor different activities like creating processes, opening network connections, changing files, things like that. And this allowed the attackers to learn how financial messages were sent and to identify which other services were in use. And one service that the attackers discovered was related to the printers. Every time an order was sent or received, it was automatically dispatched to the printer that we saw. And to keep everything under the radar, the attackers used their privileged access to misconfigure the printer. So when Bin Huda noticed that the printer wasn't working correctly, he assumed it was a printer problem, not an indication of an ongoing attack. Once inside the SWIFT system, the attackers also captured the digital certificates that are required to send messages. and also the static passwords that were used to protect these certificates. Unlike other banks, Bangladesh relied on a single factor of authentication, that static password, and it was far easier to crack. With the necessary credentials in hand and knowledge of the processes which the attackers gathered over months, they were now able to masquerade as legitimate and authorized users. Put simply, the attackers could now send payment messages that would get to and be honored by the core SWIFT network. To capture the certificates, to meddle with the printer, and more, what they did was to inject malware code that they specifically wrote for the SWIFT terminal. It was a custom-made tool for the job, and it shows intimate knowledge of the SWIFT Alliance software, which is what about 20% of SWIFT members use, including Bangladesh. Because the malware was written from scratch, it was unfamiliar to existing virus protection programs and went by unnoticed. That piece of malware was thoroughly analyzed by BAE Systems, and it tells us quite a lot, really, about how professional cyber criminals think and how they operate. It used, for example, an encrypted configuration file called gpca.dat, which had a variety of information in it, including transaction IDs and even the IP address of the command and control center. That IP address, as it turns out, was registered in Egypt, which created another layer of separation between the attackers who were not from Egypt and the command and control center. One of the modules that the malware was targeting was an Oracle database DLL. That library was responsible for reading the SWIFT Alliance database path from the registry. It was responsible for starting the database and for performing various database backup and restore operations. Now, to skip over the database authentication checks, what the malware did was it changed the SWIFT Alliance software in memory. This allowed it to bypass a critical security check, which was an if statement, simply by overriding 2 bytes that stood for jump not 0, J and Z. By making this little memory change, they not only thwarted the security check, but by doing this in memory instead of disk, it would be much harder to detect the hack. And with little tricks like this, the malware was able to grant itself the ability to covertly execute database transactions within the victim's network. In other words, they subverted perfectly normal business processes in order to remain undetected and to delay any suspicion by the victims that something was going on. In practice, some of these measures ended up destabilizing the SWIFT Alliance software, causing it to crash. And as a result, the investigation cycle started earlier than the attackers really wanted, but it was still at least a day later than it could have been. With the access that they appropriated, the attackers then used stolen SWIFT credentials to send fraudulent payment instructions, and on Thursday, the 4th of February, they initiated 35 forged transactions. Let's try to understand what ended up happening with them. Starting on the left-hand side, the first 4 transactions were to RCBC in the Philippines, and the next one was to Pan Asia Banking in Sri Lanka. The New York Fed acted on all 5 and transferred the funds, which totaled $101 million, taken out of Bangladesh's account. The next 30 transactions were flagged by the Fed as odd. After all, this was an unusually high number of payment instructions, and the transfer requests were to private entities rather than central banks, and that made the Fed suspicious. So they decided to place these transactions on hold, pending further investigation and further clarifications from Bangladesh. This was a single man-made decision by one employee, and it reduced the scope of the heist by, as you can see, $850 million, a single person's decision. Now, of the 101 million that did go through, The loan transaction to Sri Lanka of $20 million failed to go through. Some clerk at Pan Asia Bank saw an uncommonly large payment for Shalika Foundation. That was a small NGO, and he smartly decided to hold the order and to request further clarification from Deutsche Bank, which was the corresponding bank that was used for moving the money from the New York Fed to Pan Asia in Sri Lanka. Deutsche Bank took a closer look and discovered that the word foundation was misspelled as foundation with an A. So they blocked the order and sent Bangladesh a notification. Even though the bigger impact of the attack was avoided due to the attacker's mistake, relying on poor spelling should not be a security policy. But Bangladesh wasn't nearly as fortunate with the Philippines. The carefully timed attack ensured that RCBC would be out for days after the crime took place. And by that time, RCBC saw those stop payment orders from Bangladesh. Well, the money had already been piped away into those local casinos that we saw in currency exchanges. In fact, $1 million or $2 million were even withdrawn in greenbacks and carried out by for-hire armored truck vendors. The choice of the Philippines was far from accidental. In a 2017 report from the State Department, they described the Philippines as a major money laundering site. And they know that criminal groups use Filipino banks and especially casinos to transfer illicit funds to offshore accounts as a matter of standard business practice. That has since changed. Only a small part of those $81 million were ever recovered. And this wasn't just the work of a cyber crime ring. Once money hit RCBC, people, trucks, and shipments moved in the real world across borders. There are only a few known actors in the world that can pull off a criminal operation of this size and complexity. Who was it? The perpetrators, excuse me, they're known as the Lazarus Group, and to date they've been involved in financially motivated attacks on about 20 different countries. They've hacked banks, casinos, brokerages, crypto exchanges, and most recently pharmaceuticals working on COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. This group is thought to comprise of 4 related units. Each has a different objective, but they all deal with cyber operations. The attack on Bangladesh comes from a unit called APT-38. All Lazarus groups are allegedly linked to the DPRK, which is the official name of North Korea. And despite efforts by the US government to stop them, APT-38 remains active and dangerous to institutions all over the world. Now, the list of mistakes that Bangladesh Bank made can fill up entire cabinets, from poorly defined policies to outright security negligence and just bad decision-making in real time. There was everything. But if you think that Bangladesh stands out in this, think again. As the digital revolution and digital transformation expands globally and cuts across more and more industries, organizations that were never this digitally sophisticated are connecting, digitizing, and migrating to the cloud. So it's vital that we all learn from these costly lessons and that we make sure that we and our customers and partners do not repeat Bangladesh's mistakes. So let me review with you the main blunders and the main learnings from this case, and I'm going to split them into 2 categories. The first 4 lessons are really for IT and network administrators, and the last 4 lessons are useful and actionable for anyone who works on any kind of online service. The first mistake, and it remains a very common one, is to give standard users admin accounts. As a best practice, standard users shouldn't be admins of their machines. When you give people admin rights, you also give the same rights to any malware that infects the system and finds its way to the system32 folder, as an example. There are many ways, in fact, to remove local admin rights while still letting users elevate privileges when they need to do something, such as install certain software or drivers. With Windows and Active Directory, there are many ways and tools to manage local group memberships, for example, to do this. You could do this with group policy. You could do this with LAPS, the local admin password solution. But the bottom line is, as much as possible, keep standard business users to standard accounts. As we know, admin accounts protect the most sensitive assets and data. So we have to be super vigilant about their use, because if all other lines of defense fail, our best bet is to detect abnormal use of those privileged accounts. Bangladesh recorded some very odd login attempts, excuse me. They logged these attempts, but they never reviewed them and never did anything with them. There are many, many ways to take advantage of this data. There are security tools that go by many different names, from behavioral analytics to anomaly detection and threat intelligence. Microsoft has such tools, including Azure Sentinel, which uses AI to hunt for suspicious activities across hybrid IT infrastructures. We also offer Azure Defender as a hybrid cloud protection platform. Every network or every cloud deployment should use solutions like these. There is really no excuse not to do that. But that's not all, because for sensitive systems like that Swift machine, they have to be segmented off the rest of the IT network, as we mentioned. And this is often the case with retailers who have separate environments for their payment cards, or if you're a utility, you air gap your industrial control systems. Once these systems are separated from the standard network, remote access should only be allowed using a designated and hardened jump server. Using this approach, organizations can prevent malware from bouncing from its user endpoints to sensitive systems. And organizations often do this by isolating domains. So devices inside a domain reject unsolicited traffic coming from outside devices. It's common to do this with IPsec and security rules. Network admins can create logical moats around sensitive machines, even if they're on the same physical network. So I highly urge you to look at your segmentation policy. And another valuable defense is to control which applications are allowed on endpoints, because this would let you prevent unknown and malicious software from infiltrating the environment. And you could do this with things like Windows Defender application control, if you're running Server 16 and later, or Windows 10. And it ensures that only explicitly approved software and drivers can run. If Bangladesh used it or something similar to this, it could have blocked the malware from spreading so easily throughout the network. And now let's take a look at the 4 things that you should do for your service that Bangladesh Bank neglected. And this is really for everyone, I think. So for sensitive systems, you can't go too hard on securing your accounts and credentials. So what are the 4 best practices really for securing these credentials? Number 1 is protect your credentials in one central, trustworthy safe. So identify what that safe will be for your organization and use it for all your credentials. Then the second thing would be to control access based on role and on a just-in-time basis. So think of it as only the relevant personnel and only when needed. The next thing, which we always say, is to use multiple authentication factors, because that helps against phishing and password reuse. And the fourth is to rotate credentials. This helps you invalidate any potentially compromised credentials. If Bangladesh had even some of these measures in place, then taking over the Swift terminal would have been a challenge of another magnitude. Azure provides these capabilities with Azure Key Vault, and that should be your trustworthy safe in the cloud, if you ask me. Bangladesh Bank, like other banks, was, as we explained, at the edge of the SWIFT network. But what about the core of the network? Regardless of what service you run, if you have a centralized architecture, let's say like SWIFT, then the core of your network is a treasure trove for high quality signals. So take advantage of that. And how do you do that? Well, one way is to run big data analysis and to try to identify sophisticated threats and flag them for audit. This is essentially what the Fed did for 30 of the 35 payment orders. But SWIFT didn't do it. SWIFT had all the data. It didn't make use of that data to identify potential fraudulent activity. The second thing you could do is to use your core network to send out-of-band reports of major events. So don't trust the endpoints and the terminals because they can be compromised too. Think of other ways, maybe sending an SMS message to a designated account officer. The seventh lesson of the 8, and this is similar with many different breaches, is that organizations should never rely on the perimeter or the so-called walled garden approach. You should always assume that your network or your VNet will get penetrated. We call it assume breach. And you can trust actors inside your network as a result. That's when planning should really start. How do I prevent lateral movement? How do I defend against a compromised user account? What is the blast radius in these cases? These are all questions we have to ask ourselves. And the right approach is strong identity and access management. We say at Microsoft that identity is the control plane. At the center of our trust is authenticating and establishing trust in the user's identity. So never protect your resources based on network access, but based on identity. And Azure Active Directory has everything you need for that kind of zero trust networking. Make sure you define granular access controls based on the sensitivity of your data. And if you utilize it well, Azure Active Directory is an excellent path to implementing a zero trust approach. There are many other great solutions from Akamai to Zscaler. Choose your own and implement as much of it as you can for zero trust networking. And lastly, be ready to respond even when you are least ready. It's my long-winded way to say always be ready. Attackers seek weaknesses. They ask themselves, when is my target at its weakest? Lazarus exploited a perfect storm. Weekend in Bangladesh, followed by holiday in the Philippines. The best defense, my friends, is to be ready all the time, responding in the same way, 24/7, 365 days a year. And you do that by creating incident response playbooks, IRPs, okay, for every service, even for problems that seem very innocent. So include questions if you were Bangladesh, like how do I reach the Fed on a weekend? What if it happens on a weekend and you need to reach out to them? That should be part of the playbook. Or questions like, what should I do if the Swift printer fails? Do I just open a service call and get back to it tomorrow? Or do I go to the Swift server right away and look at the logs? These are all things that should be thought of well ahead of time. The attack on Bangladesh Bank demonstrated plenty of advanced planning, but the methods that they used were not so sophisticated. They made mistakes and everything was preventable. As part of the shared responsibility model, which we employ on the cloud, so if you're doing cloud computing, you share a responsibility with your cloud provider. We all need to make full use of the security tools and practices that come available as part of that shared responsibility model. I mentioned a few of them. These tools are out there and we encourage you to use them in order to action out some of these lessons. Crime syndicates like Lazarus, they're monitoring all kinds of organizations. I want to be very clear about this, and all kinds of institutions. If you have something of value, whether that is cash laying around or the formula for your monoclonal antibodies, whatever your organization is working on, you might be on their radar. So let's make sure to be ahead of the curve by adopting best practices, making use of the best available tools, and remaining vigilant and always a little bit paranoid. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eden. I will take this opportunity and share my screen to update the audience on some upcoming events and basically just go through a public community landing page. So this is our landing page. Basically, let me just share here the link with you all. And you probably heard me many times referencing to the aka.ms/security community. So basically, the best way to ensure that you don't miss any future major announcements that goes on in with our products that we support. So we have the webinar section, and that's the aka.ms security webinars. This is basically where we list all the upcoming webinars, as well as maintain a repository of our past webinars, such as this one will be. We'll make it onto the list here, and it will be under the recordings, broken down by a product. Whereas for this webinar, this will fall into the miscellaneous security webinars. So for the upcoming webinars, what I would like to highlight is the one on March 16. Sue Lowe will share with us her journey and advice on how to increase the diversity in cybersecurity. Sue is the author of Raven, a young adult hacker novel, which is inspiring girls and other underrepresented groups to enter STEM fields. This webinar will be the first in a series on diversity and inclusion in cybersecurity, so we hope to see you then. Going back to the security community page, we have the videos section. This is basically where we have the bite-sized videos taking you to our YouTube channel, a same channel where we keep our recordings. And then if you would like to become part of our email list, which we normally send out at least once a month announcing our upcoming events, you can do so. And then we have other helpful information, such as the Ninja training done for different products. And then we have the podcast, private communities. Here with our private communities, you can sign up and you can speak directly to our engineering teams that actually create our security products. And you'll be able also to influence our product designs and get early access to changes. So that's all I had to share, and then you have other information as a GitHub for each product. So going back to Eden, I see you refreshing yourself, and looks like you may be ready to answer some questions. Or
yeah, we can take some questions, absolutely. So the first question: was it not investigated to find out what did happen? So there were many different investigations. As you can imagine, this comprised of so many different elements. You had elements in the Philippines, in Sri Lanka, the Fed, SWIFT, and obviously in Bangladesh and beyond that. So many different investigations were carried out, including by private institutions. I mentioned BAE Systems. That was one of them. To give you some idea of the events that followed in the 5 years past, Bangladesh Bank itself filed several civil suits, mostly against RCBC in the Philippines. Filipino authorities, if I'm not mistaken, fined RCBC for its negligence of duty about $20 million. Of that, $15 million were awarded back to Bangladesh Bank as relief money. It was found that RCBC was negligent in failing to flag these dormant accounts that showed a sudden surge of activity. In general, when you're a bank and you see sudden bursts of activity, These are excellent triggers for compliance audits. RCBC never went through the hassle of auditing that. So yes, investigations certainly took place, but the money, most of it was not recovered. I believe that as of now, at least $66 million out of the $81 million were never returned back to Bangladesh. The next question was the NGO transfer just a donation, or is it likely an organization controlled by one of the attackers? That's a good question. I do not know. I would presume that the $20 million that were sent to the NGO were sent with the intent of cashing that money out. So I would imagine that that NGO was either compromised or through some other means, Lazarus would have been able to get the money out of that NGO's account. These are my speculations. It's not based on any credible material that I've seen. The next question is, was Microsoft involved in the incident response and remediation of the attack? I presume so. Microsoft was not involved. This was not on a cloud environment, at least not on the Microsoft cloud environment. This was an on-premises deployment. The Bank of Bangladesh used Microsoft software, as I believe every central bank does to some extent. And we were not involved in this, to my awareness. And the last question that I'm seeing here is, how would the Fed in the US have stopped the transfer? That point is not clear. You mentioned that it was too late for them on the next day. So first of all, the Fed was not found guilty in any misconduct here. Just to be clear, the Fed received what seemed like legitimate requests from Bangladesh Bank to move money to other accounts. And it did that for 5 of those 35 requests. Now, why didn't it do it for 30 requests? Simply because it made a good decision that they seemed suspicious. Now, we could have said, well, why didn't it flag all 35 transactions, or maybe any number larger than 30? Why did it only flag 30 transactions as suspicious transactions? So I think they could have done a little bit more. Like I explained, they saved $850 from moving into the wrong accounts. I think they could have done it for more than that amount. It's all about its fraud detection systems. Ideally, I think the Fed had enough data and historical information and the ability to correlate transactions to tell that even the first 5 transactions should not have gone through without confirmation. They placed 30 transactions on hold. That was great. I think they could have done it possibly for a few more transactions. And since 2016, when this happened, both the Federal Reserve and SWIFT have significantly ramped up many of their measures in order to flag transactions that seem illegitimate and to respond to them more quickly. One example of a very positive operational step that the Fed took is that they instituted a 24/7 hotline to deal with exactly these types of emergencies. And this is set up for the 250 or so central banks of the world. So if the next Bin Huda sees an email telling him that suspicious activity was detected, he doesn't have to wait 2 days until he can get in touch with the Fed and try to reverse the transactions. One thing to note is that when the money moves from the Fed to a receiving bank, that money is still available to be reversed back until it gets withdrawn. And what happened in the case of RCBC, as soon as the money hit RCBC accounts, it was immediately moved out either to regional branch accounts or RCBC, or just cashed out as greenbacks. So that's why the Fed could really not do much about the $80 million that moved to RCBC. I hope that explains that.
Thank you so much, Eden, for an excellent presentation, and thank you to the rest of the team who helped answering the questions. But most of all, I want to thank all of you for being a part of our community and for joining us on webinars like this, and we hope to see you next time. Goodbye.